ainda pela apresentação do Rui, o Alan que está aqui nos bastidores, e vou ligar então a minha tela aqui e começar. Okay, so I'd like to thank you all once again for attending the virtual seminar. And this is joint work with Dejani Silva at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and Chao Zi, who's moving from the University of Illinois to the Shanghai Advanced Institute for Finance as soon as people can actually move. And what we study are the consequences of under-diversification in investment for optimal policy. So, okay. So first, we want to highlight the importance of idiosyncratic investment risk. And one important feature of idiosyncratic risk is that it's large. So if you look at the y-axis, you can see that it varies from something like a little bit below 10% to 15%, which is comparable to market volatility. This graph, I'm gonna go into detail about how we construct this, but this is a conditional volatility of the median firm. And idiosyncratic risk wouldn't matter if we were talking about frictionless markets. So, and that's a key insight of the CAPM or most asset pricing models. So here it's going to be a story about the effects of financial frictions and issues in diversifying risk. So one and this phenomenon has been documented empirically by several papers and several studies, and here are a few references. So once you start from a point of view in which investors are not perfectly diversified, it has multiple consequences that we're going to study. So and consequences that have been studied previously by other authors. So first, there are consequences for asset prices. And what we're going to highlight here in the paper is that there's going to be an idiosyncratic risk premium because investors are not perfectly diversified, and they are going to also require compensation for variations in this idiosyncratic volatility. So if you expect volatility if you expect idiosyncratic volatility to be high, as it would be in bad times, you would expect a higher compensation. You would demand a higher compensation for holding that idiosyncratic volatility. And we're going to study a production asset pricing model in which firms make important decisions, not only about the level of investment, but also about the composition of investment across different projects. So the firm here is going to differ from a standard firm in a macro scenario in which you simply choose the scale of the operation. Here, firms are going to choose how to operate and where to invest their resources. And projects are going to have different degrees of risk exposure. So there's going to be an important portfolio problem inside the firm. And this is not so common. A few elements like this have shown up here and there in the literature. And third, idiosyncratic risk has also spurred a big literature in macroeconomics. And that is really focused on the cyclical aspect of idiosyncratic risk. So a literature by Bloom and co-authors and several follow-up papers studies that the cyclical properties and how that can cause sluggish recoveries and lower incentives for investment if you have an anti-cyclical uncertainty that makes it harder for firms to pay fixed costs and make large investments. Okay, so but most of the, at least as far as we know, all of this literature has been positive and emphasizing different aspects or different consequences of idiosyncratic risk. And as far as we know, we are the first ones to ask, should anybody do anything about this? Should policy try to target? Are the consequences of these imperfections constraint efficient in any sense? So the key question that we ask is, if you see that under-diversification is an issue and you cannot do anything to directly target diversification in investors' investments, is there anything else that should be done? And the answer is positive, affirmative. And so in this paper, we studied the policy implications of these distortions caused by under-diversification. And we show that the economy is constraint inefficient. So I'm going to show you the model and the key elements for that model, in which we're going to derive this constraint inefficiency result. And for people less familiar with the literature on optimal policy, by constraint inefficient, we mean, is there anything that policy can do if it cannot directly target the constraint that people are facing? So people here are not going to be able to fully invest in all the firms of the economy. So they're going to only invest in a subset, and they're going to be holding a disproportionate share of the risk of those firms. And what we show is that in this setup, there's a novel pecuniary externality that shows up. And the key effect that's external to investment decisions of each agent in this economy is that whenever firms are making their investment decisions, they're not taking into account that they're going to shape the distribution of risk that is borne by other firms. So after showing this result, we're going to derive and apply some sufficient statistics for the externality. And these sufficient statistics are based on asset prices. So we're going to leverage asset pricing data to give us some notion of how big are the welfare gains that policy could aim to achieve. And we also derive, I don't have the hope of going into detail about the optimal financial regulation, but we also derive consequences for optimal financial regulation. And we show how our measurement results can be used to calibrate optimal policy. And we also show that the policy can be implemented with standard instruments that you see in taxation and financial policy, such as a tax shield on debt and risk weights on capital, on assets. Okay. So let me give you an overview of the model that we study. So it's going to be a two-period asset pricing model with two central features. The first one is that there's going to be under-diversification by design. So that's going to be the key constraint. And that under-diversification that investors face is going to create endogenous return risk. And importantly, it's going to create return dispersion across investors. And the way that we derive this is we study a circular economy, and each investor only has access to firms that are relatively close or are in his or her access set. And these firms are making investment and risk-taking decisions. And by risk-taking decisions, we mean that they have a non-trivial portfolio problem of their own. And they are going to produce using capital and labor. And it's important that there's some other variable inputs besides the capital that they invested in at date zero. And the investors are going to buy shares of these firms. Okay, so we're going to derive some asset pricing results. And we're going to show that idiosyncratic risk, because it's not perfectly diversifiable in this setting, it will carry a premium. And by carrying a premium, it will change the stochastic discount factor. It will change the investment decisions of firms. And we also show that there's going to be an idiosyncratic variance risk premium, and I'll go into the details soon. And we are going to show a constraint inefficiency result. And that constraint inefficiency result, we're going to emphasize two features. One is that from a social perspective, it's going to look as if the economy invested too little in capital in the first place. And the second feature is that because of the cyclical properties of idiosyncratic risk, is going to look as if the firm is exposed to excessive aggregate risk. So a planner or any optimal policy designer would try to dampen risk-taking in this economy. So we're going to show what are the sufficient statistics that we use for calibrating, for first assessing how big the distortions are, and second for calibrating the optimal policy instruments. And last, we discussed briefly how we can use that for calibrating risk-weighted capital requirements and a tax shield to implement the optimal allocation. Okay, so now I'm going to provide you more details about the model. And as we're dealing with this new setup and it's all virtual, I'm not seeing any faces or any expressions. So please feel free to jump in if you have any questions and help me out with clarifying any issues. So it's going to be a two-period economy. So there's a date zero, and at date zero is a key portfolio decisions that are going to be made. So investors are going to choose how much equity to buy of each of the firms that they can buy some equity, and firms in their turn are going to choose how much physical capital to buy. And when when the firms are making that decision, I'm going to show you soon, they're going to be, they have a menu of alternatives. And the key feature of this environment is that agents and firms are located in a circle of circumference 1. And okay, but I don't want you to take the kind of the geographical feature of this or the spatial feature of this too seriously. The idea is that some agents are going to be naturally closer to some firms. And you can imagine this as if some agents know better of the conditions of some firms, some agents work in some sectors and they understand the details of those sectors. And last, geography does play a role. It's common and it's documented that people typically invest a little bit more in the firms that are geographically closer to them. But you can think of proximity here in a broader sense, not really too much in a geographic sense. Okay, so workers only live at date 1. And the key feature here is that the workers are going to be the agents that are going to be consuming the payouts from their labor supply. They're going to be consuming the wage bill of the economy. And the key role of workers here is just offering some other input besides capital for production. Okay, so let me go into some detail about the firms. So the firms are going to be indexed by J. That's going to vary between 0 and 1. So they're going to be they're going to be organized around that circle. And then location 1 and location 0 are the same location. So okay, so firms at date 0, they're going to raise equity and they're going to make investment decisions. And they face two technologies. They face a riskless technology, and the riskless technology is the one that you would imagine as the most standard technology in macro finance models or in macro model. You invest 1 unit of capital today, and for sure you're going to have 1 unit of capital tomorrow. But the risky technology is a key source of aggregate risk. It means that for 1 unit that you invest today, you're going to get a number of units that depend on a capital quality shock. So the efficiency of that risky capital depends on the realization of the aggregate state. And that's the only source of aggregate risk. So all aggregate risk here means whether the number of efficiency units of capital is going to be higher or lower in the economy. And at date 1, firms are going to produce final goods, and they're going to combine the two inputs, capital and labor, using a neoclassical production function. We're going to have a Cobb-Douglas in the baseline version of the model. So very simple. And the key thing here is that at date 1, there's aggregate risk, which is all embedded in the number of units of capital that are present, but productivity is idiosyncratic. And firms only learn their productivity at date 1. So they're going to see their productivity, and then they go to input markets and they hire as much labor as it is optimal for them, given that productivity that they learn at date 1. And productivity is going to be identically distributed across firms, but is not going to be independent, and that is important for us. So, and that lack of independence is going to mean that firms that are closer together are firms that are going to be correlated. And that is going to be an important source of under-diversification in the economy. And let me go into more detail in the next few slides. But before we discuss the proximity of firms and idiosyncratic productivity, let me just describe a little bit better the setup in terms of the number of capital units that each investment technology produces. So basically what we're going to be studying here is a setup in which aggregate uncertainty is going to fan out in only two states. So there's going to be a high state in which output is going to be higher, and so the high state is going to be the state in which the risky investment technology is going to deliver more units, and the capital stock in this stage is going to be naturally higher than the capital stock in this stage here. So what happens is, first there's the safe investment technology, which is the most standard one that we see in macro 0, macro 1, whatever. So invest 1 unit here and you get 1 unit of capital tomorrow. And there's a risky investment technology that delivers capital that's relatively more efficient in the good stage. And this is a source of a higher capital stock, higher output, and will be a source of higher wages in the high stage. While in the low stage, the output of that technology is lower, and it actually pays off less. Okay, so that's a key source of aggregate risk. So when firms come to date 1, they learn their productivity, which is this theta J, and they decide, and capital is already pinned down as a function of the investment decisions that they took at date 0. So capital is inelastic for them at that moment, and the only decision that they have is how much labor to demand. So they're going to demand labor, and the labor demand decisions actually going to be linear in the effective number of capital units they have. So this is going to make these firms are going to be paying dividends, and because of heterogeneity in theta, because of heterogeneity in productivity, these firms are going to be paying heterogeneous dividends to their investors. And the return that they're going to get on each unit of capital that they have is going to be heterogeneous and depend positively on their own productivity. So because firms cannot compete, because capital cannot flow to the most productive firms anymore, because it has been installed already from date 0 to date 1, there's going to be some heterogeneity in profits. And that heterogeneity in profits is going to create heterogeneous returns. One important feature that I want to highlight here is that profit margins are going to respond to aggregate conditions, and they're going to respond because wages vary across states. So basically, when output is high, when aggregate production is high, because there's a high number of effective capital units, wages are going to be high, and wages would depress profit margins. On the other hand, there's some effects in which, according to which firms that are particularly more productive are going to have high returns, firms that are less productive are going to have lower returns. Okay. So one important thing is, soon in a few slides, we're going to restrict attention to equilibria which are symmetric, in which all firms make the same decisions, but so far we're indexing investment decisions by the firm's identity J. And here, basically what we're going to have is that the number of effective units of capital that firms have is going to be a function of their investment decisions, how much they choose to invest in technology 0, which is the riskless technology, and how much they chose to invest in technology 1, which is the risky technology that has a stochastic payoff here. Okay, so what firms are going to be choosing at date 0 is just they understand how their returns are going to behave, and they choose how much to invest in the two technologies just to maximize the dividends that they're going to be paying to their stockholders using the stochastic discount factor of those stockholders. So that is how investment decisions take place in this environment. And okay, so a key feature is that firms that are relatively close from J and J prime have a correlation in their idiosyncratic TFP. Oh, sorry. Okay. Have a correlation in their idiosyncratic TFP that depends on the distance. So it varies from very close to 1 for firms that are extremely close to something like -1/2, which holds for the two firms that are exactly opposed across a circle. And that structure creates a kind of correlation that vanishes if you look over the whole circle. So if you integrate anything over the whole circle with the structure that we borrow from Garliano, Padagias, and a co-author, we have that productivity risk is diversifiable only if you're holding a portfolio that ranges the whole circle, that covers the whole circle. But a typical investor will not be having access to the whole circle. A typical investor is going to be having access only to firms that are sufficiently close to him or her. And in this parameter phi, is this distance parameter, it's going to control how diversified the individual investors can be. So we have two important particular cases. So one particular case that you can have in mind is when phi equals 1, every agent can hold all the firms, including the firms that's exactly opposed to that agent. When phi equals 0, each agent only has access to a firm that's located at exactly the same location. So with these two particular cases, one which shows up in many models of entrepreneurial investment is this entrepreneurial model in which each agent is holding a firm and each firm is completely held by a single agent. And the other setup is the frictionless setup in which everyone can invest over the whole circle and idiosyncratic risk doesn't matter anymore. So we're going to characterize the equilibrium in this economy. Okay, so we're going to focus on a symmetric equilibrium. So all agents are going to be consuming the same at date 0. All the firms are going to be making the same investment across each of the two technologies. So the technologies here are indexed by K. And the price of all firms is going to be the same. The price of equity in every firm is going to be the same. Unfortunately, the model doesn't deliver a closed form solution. So we're going to use perturbation arguments around an economy in which there's no idiosyncratic risk. And we're going to study how small deviations from that manifest themselves as risk premia and changes in investment composition, changes in risk taking. So right now we are revising this model, and one of the things we're doing is we're changing the way that we build this circular economy to have a structure that allows you to have under-diversification without having to have correlation across firms that are decreasing correlations for firms that are closer together. That decreasing correlation structure that I emphasized. And the way to do that, instead of using a Brownian motion for constructing the distribution of TFP, you can use a gamma process, and that potentially helps. That's one of the things that we hope to be able to present soon. And
I didn't get that one.
Okay, yeah, don't worry too much about that. So one thing is, right now we construct the correlation structure for these firms using a Brownian bridge, and it's kind of all in the background. The key feature here is that there's a source of risk, there's a distribution shock of TFP over the circle, and that distribution vanishes. So there's no variance if you can hold a diversified portfolio.
Yeah.
But that gives us some complications, because we lose closed form solutions for away from the small risk cases. So we can only get a characterization of the equilibrium around a zero idiosyncratic risk equilibrium. So, and there's another way that we're exploring for constructing this correlation structure, or for constructing this under-diversification, that's not going to rely on a Brownian bridge, but is going to rely on a gamma bridge that has some other nice features. Okay, so that's a parenthetical comment. So one thing is, we solved the portfolio problem of the investors, and we showed that for small risks, what investors have to do is to minimize the variance of their equity holdings. So they simply minimize the variance of the return they have on their equity investments. And it turns out that the minimal variance is a function of that structural parameter phi. And as you would expect, it is zero when phi, sorry, so the minimal, so it is the variance, the idiosyncratic variance they have is a negative function of their diversification parameter phi. So the idea is, if you could hold the whole circle, you could perfectly diversify, and you would not be holding any idiosyncratic risk in your portfolio. So basically, if you have phi equals 1, that implies that this parameter that is going to be key for our measurement, phi u, would be 0. There's no idiosyncratic risk left in the investor's portfolio, despite the fact that there's idiosyncratic risk on the investment that firms are making.
And just to be sure, there's no aggregate risk either, no? So is there?
So aggregate risk will not be diversifiable. So an aggregate risk comes from the fact that we have these capital quality shocks. So the quantity of capital and output that the economy can produce depends on the realization of the investment technologies. So and investors will be holding that risk. So the question here about when they minimize variance, they are minimizing the idiosyncratic variance. So investors are choosing among the firms that they have access to, among the firms that are sufficiently close to their location, they're choosing how to distribute their equity investments. And the key thing is, there's going to be, so the phi 1 case and the phi 0 case, which is when that makes phi u be 1, which means that investors are going to be holding all of the idiosyncratic risk if they are essentially entrepreneurs who cannot diversify anything away from their own firms.
And what is the intuition why you want to minimize the idiosyncratic risk? I guess you mentioned before that there would be a premium associated with that. So
there's a premium. There's a premium associated with that, but it's a symmetric equilibrium. So every firm is holding, is paying the same premium on their equity. So when you're deciding the portfolio composition, you cannot really change how much of that premium you're holding, or any portfolio that you structure across these firms is going to be earning the same returns, but some of these portfolios are going to have too much risk, so they're not as well diversified as possible. I'm not sure if that answers. So I can try to rephrase that.
All portfolios have the same expected return somehow. So the only thing you care about.
Exactly, because of symmetry across firms, all the portfolios have the same expected returns. But you can, despite the fact that they're holding some premium for idiosyncratic risk. But the premium for idiosyncratic risk does not depend whether you're holding too much of the idiosyncratic risk of firm J as opposed to firm J prime.
There's no heterogeneity in.
Yeah, exactly. So that's the logic. Yeah. Okay, so then in this equilibrium, what happens is that returns on assets are going to be, so firms are going, so each firm J is I write it in one place, it shows up in another. I'm sorry. So returns that these firms are going to be earning on their assets are going to depend positively on their own TFP, are going to depend negatively on aggregate TFP, and negatively on the aggregate capital stock. So there's a notion of competition here. As I had shown before, firms are competing for labor services in the labor market. So a firm that is relatively more productive is going to hire more workers and is going to produce more, but is going to have to pay those workers according to wages that are determined essentially by the average firm. And the average firm has a TFP theta and has a capital stock KS. So this creates a dependence on the stage for the returns that each firm is going to earn, and on the aggregate stage, irrespective, which is going to be interacting with their own productivity. And last, just to clarify, because the timing is not so standard. So the return that each equity holder is going to earn on firm J is going to be a product of two returns. So this guy is just a return on the investment that the firm made. So the firm is going to purchase assets and spend this amount of resources, and those investments are going to generate heterogeneous numbers of units of capital. And then, so basically this term here is the number of capital units that firm J brings to production at day 1. And the term that is multiplying this is the return they get on each of those units of capital they have. So that is the return they're going to be paying on their equity. It's a product of the return they got on physical capital, and then a return they get that depends on their profit margin and the behavior of the labor market and the economy. So then now we're gonna show you some asset pricing results. So first, we're going to denote the log of a variable with a lowercase. So the consumption that each investor is going to get is going to be simply a product, which in the log is going to be showing up as a sum of the return on assets, that is the average return on assets that the firms in his portfolio had, and a return on physical capital investment. And when you compute expected excess returns for this economy, what happens is that this guy here is going to co-vary with the consumption of the agent, is going to show up and is going to be the source of the idiosyncratic risk premium. So what happens is you can write the expected excess return in a formula which has a component that is reminiscent of the CAPM, and another component that comes from the fact that agents that are holding the stock of each firm J have a stochastic discount factor that depends particularly on the specific return that firm J delivers. So this generates some excess volatility of the stochastic discount factor that co-varies with the return of the firms that each investor holds. So there's going to be an aggregate risk premium, and there's also going to be a compensation for holding idiosyncratic risk. And how big that compensation is depends on the product of three terms. So one is a preference parameter, a risk preference parameter. If agents are more risk averse, the risk premium is going to be higher. The second element is how diversifiable was that risk. If it's perfectly diversifiable, if you can hold the whole circle, then phi u vanishes to zero. On the other hand, if it's an entrepreneurial economy, this term disappears, and you're holding all of the risk of the investment in the firm. And the third term that shows up here is the level, how much idiosyncratic risk is present in this economy to begin with. So basically, the key thing in the end is that you have to, the risk premium is going to be decomposed as something that depends on risk aversion, on this under-diversification parameter that depends on the structure of the excess sets that investors have, and the quantity of risk which can vary with good and bad states.
Felipe, just a quick question. This equation looks like interesting for estimation because seems exponential Garch, right? You have expected return, right? But you have two terms there that will be very hard to estimate, gamma and phi. You have something else because they are key for your model.
Yeah,
I'm sorry if I'm jumping.
So gamma and phi are not going to be separately identifiable.
Okay.
But we are able to estimate the price of risk. So we are able to estimate the product of gamma and phi, and then take your preferred estimate for gamma, you can back out phi.
Okay.
Okay. So and I hope I'm not sure I'll have time. I don't think I'll have time anymore. But I hope to show you how we estimate these things.
Okay. All right. We have an additional question from Alex Ferreira. Alex, I will unmute you and then you can ask your question directly. Just a sec. Okay. Okay, Alex, go on.
Okay, thank you very much for the very interesting seminar. The correlation between the firms TFP, they could be diversified away, right? That's what I understood from your explanation. However, in equilibrium, they cannot. Firms agent cannot diversify it. So in practice, isn't this another source of systematic risk, which is given by undiversification? I mean, why do we need to think of it as a idiosyncratic risk?
Okay, so let me.
You can see that there is a shock, but this shock is going to. Okay.
Okay, perfect. Yeah. So the important thing is idiosyncratic risk here is defined in a way that if you integrate it over the whole economy, it vanishes. So for aggregate output and for everything, for wages and everything, this doesn't show up anywhere. But for each investor that is close to the firms, that investor can only have access to a region of the circle which is locally correlated. So that guy, so imagine somebody that is particularly familiar with mining firms. So that agent is typically going to invest a little bit more in mining. And mining firms are correlated. So despite the fact that by construction, the sector level of risk is vanishing over the circle, that guy that has special access to mining firms is particularly exposed to mining factors. And that investor then is going to demand a higher premium. And while this is true for this guy that is holding a disproportionate share of mining in his portfolio, is going to be true for somebody else that lives across the circle and it's not holding mining firms, but is holding tech companies. So the idea here is that by construction, everything that we call idiosyncratic could be diversified if agents could hold the whole circle of firms. But also, by construction, agents are more exposed, are more familiar, or they have some bias. In the end, what matters is that their portfolio are only covering a range of the circle. So this is, you can motivate this in different ways, something that looks less geographic or less sector based. But the idea is that for agents are going to be, it could depend on private equity, firms that are not publicly traded and things like this. But the whole point is that conditional on aggregates, people are still holding portfolios that are not perfectly diversified. And here we do it by construction. It's a friction that tells you, and a friction that matters when phi is less than 1, when you cannot hold the whole circle.
So the error term in, for example, the asset price equations of the, this, I understood that you have a sort of representative agent, right?
Yes. Because of symmetry.
Symmetry, yes, symmetry. But in terms, I'm thinking in terms of, let's say, estimating your model. I would think of a sort of a seemingly unrelated regression. That's what I have in mind. So you'd have a sort of shock that would be idiosyncratic, but part of it would be, common to all the firms. I know that it's not all the firms, but it's some region geographically. That's how you're thinking of it. Yeah. So I really don't, but I see these as a sort of systematic risk, not a sort of.
The idea here is condition on everything that's aggregate. People are still holding something that depends on their identities and their access sets and the portfolios that they construct. So I'm not sure that answered, but so let me try to come back to that because I think if we can cover the empirical exercise, it might help answer some of a part of your question.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so let me see if I can get there. Okay, so the key thing here is that returns are going to carry an idiosyncratic risk premium, and returns depend on production. And returns depend on production because profit margins depend on production. And here we have two effects. You have the effect of, you have an aggregate term that depends on, that is inherited from labor markets and competition for the variable input, which here is labor. And you have something which depends on the identity of the firms, and this is what gives rise to dispersion in returns. So when you look at the dispersion of returns for any given stage for any realization of the aggregate shock, what you have is that you have some exogenous component that depends on the dispersion of theta, depends on the dispersion of idiosyncratic TFP, which here, to simplify matters, we made it not vary with anything of any aggregate feature of the model. And you have that the dispersion, dispersion here is compressed in states in which TFP is relatively higher or the capital stock is higher. So basically here is a term that varies with output and the demand for labor. And this is an endogenous component that feeds into return dispersion. And here it's important. This is a key feature. This is a key source of the pecuniary externality that gives rise to inefficiencies in this setup. So, what is important here is that in relatively better states from the aggregate perspective, you're going to have that effective capital is higher and that is going to lower the idiosyncratic return dispersion. And the idea is that because there's going to be more demand, kind of more competition for variable inputs when the economy is relatively more heated, you're going to reduce margins. And when you reduce margins, you're going to hurt disproportionately more high profit firms because they're hiring more labor, they're bigger, they're producing more. And this is related to something that has been documented empirically and has been called the operating leverage channel. So basically the key source here is that profit margins are heterogeneous across firms and they are cyclical. Profit margins are higher in the so here this is tricky. So conditional on your productivity, profit margins are lower when wages are higher. So profit margins are lower in the relatively heated high output states. And so this mechanism that is very simple and is able to produce countercyclical return risk because you have compression of returns that is countercyclical. It can create synchronization of idiosyncratic risk because there's some aggregate component that's feeding into idiosyncratic risk. And it also creates a negative premium for exposure to idiosyncratic risk through the same sources. Okay, so, I have very little time. Let me give you a brief overview of the externalities that are present here, 2 key results about inefficiencies, and let me see how far I can get in terms of describing how we measure the degree of inefficiency here. Okay, so the key question that we try to ask then, after deriving some asset pricing results, is showing that can a planner improve the market allocation? And we showed that a planner can, that well-designed policy can improve the market allocation, and that the gains that it can reap from implementing a better allocation are related to the risk premia that we initially characterized. Okay, so what are we gonna do? Imagine that a planner can simply mandate a different form of investment. So imagine that I0 and I1 are the investment levels in the riskless and the risky technology that would take place absent any intervention, and perturb that with some delta. So what we're gonna do here is a parametric perturbation, and the capital stock is going to vary across states, and it's going to depend on the magnitude of the policy and the direction of the policy. So kappas naught and kappa 1 are going to describe for us the direction of the perturbation. So for instance, if you make kappa naught and kappa 1 equal and equal to 1, you're making an increase in investment that is the same across the 2 technologies. We can also study something that makes kappa 1 negative and kappa 0 positive and keeps the average investment the same. And that is a kind of shock that's a kind of perturbation that would change the composition of investment and would favor the riskless alternative to the risky alternative. So if you look at a direction of perturbation in which kappa naught is positive and kappa 1 is negative, you're studying perturbations in aggregate risk taking and a dampening in aggregate risk taking. And to study those perturbations, if you change the investment levels, you're going to change the capital stock at date 1, and you're going to change the behavior of the labor market. Whenever you change the behavior of the labor market, you're going to change the consumption of workers, and they would gain or lose from that intervention. So to neutralize and to study welfare, what we do is imagine that any wage increase can be taxed away from workers and rebated back to investors as a depreciation allowance. So basically rebated in a way that's proportional to the capital they have. And then what we do is we write this welfare function as a function of the perturbation. And the key question is, for some direction of perturbation, kappa 0, kappa 1, is V prime different from 0? Which means that can you perturb this economy a little bit and get any efficiency gains from perturbing it in the right direction? And what we showed then is there are two key perturbations. First, suppose that you increase investment in the riskless technology. So this is going to increase aggregate capital stock in all the states in the same fashion, and you're not perturbing the risky investment technology. And what we show is that a perturbation of this form, it would, of course, if you increase investment, you're going to increase wages. And increasing wages would lower profit margins for everyone. So the way to neutralize and would increase worker welfare. So to be able to assess whether that could lead to a gain or not, you can tax away the wage gain and rebate it as a depreciation allowance. And what we show is that because there's a covariance between marginal rates of substitution and returns, because agents that see high returns or agents that have low marginal utility, there's a reason for increasing investment in this economy. And basically what happens here is that when you increase investment, you're changing the profit margins. And when you change the profit margins, you're going to hurt disproportionately more the high profit, high productivity firms that are being held by agents that have high returns and high consumption and therefore low marginal utility of consumption. So the idea here is that by increasing investment, you lower margins and you make exceptional firms less exceptional, and the exceptional returns that their investors receive less exceptional. And the welfare gain from a perturbation like this is proportional to the idiosyncratic risk premium and to a measure of the disagreement between the average idiosyncratic risk held under the risk neutral probability and the objective probability measure, which is an object that has shown up in the empirical finance literature before as the variance risk premium. And here, the feature that is important in our environment is that what matters is the idiosyncratic part of the variance risk premium. And okay, so then, okay, I'll skip some things. And then another perturbation that we studied. So first is there are reasons to perturb investment. And these reasons are measured and related to the magnitude of the idiosyncratic risk premium and this variance risk premium, which would not be present in economies with perfect diversification. So notice that in the benchmark in which everyone could hold the whole circle, this term would vanish to 0 and this term would also vanish to 0. And also something that is important is that the channel through which this is manifesting is because it's the operating leverage. It's because wages change profit margins. And not only wages, if we had any other intermediate inputs and there was competition for those intermediate inputs, that would also generate that any form of pro-cyclical competition would give you incentives to distort the allocation and increase investment. So here, this shows up because alpha is not 1, because this is not an economy in which returns are exogenous. You have a potential gain whenever phi u is greater than 0. Okay, so let me mention another intervention. So also for similar reasons, a planner would choose, imagine that you could perturb the investment that firms are making and disincentivize investment in the risky technology, which was technology 1, and channel that investment to technology 0. And what we show is that a perturbation that implements something like this is a perturbation that raises welfare, and the gain from raising welfare is measurable according to this idiosyncratic variance risk premium. And the idea here is when firms are making investment in the risky capital technology, they're making output higher in the high output stage, and they're bringing wages up in that stage. And they are, because they are not investing in the relatively safer technology, they are helping increase or they are helping decrease the wages, or they are making the wage volatility in the economy relatively higher. So what happens is that investment in the risky technology makes margins more volatile in this economy. And because it makes margins more volatile, it increases the problem that it basically it increases the magnitude of the frictions. So basically what happens is that idiosyncratic risk is countercyclical. Idiosyncratic risk is higher when the economy is depressed. If you invest in the risky technology, you make the economy relatively more volatile. So you make dispersion worse when it's more depressed, when the economy is more depressed. And that's kind of how investment decisions in the risk technology are actually amplifying the extent of the inefficiencies in the setup. Okay, so now let me ask Alan, can I show something related to the measurement, or did I run out of time?
Yeah, well, I think we have maybe 5 minutes more.
Okay, so let me, for you? Let me try. Let me try, okay. Because it's not going to be much. So I'm going to have to refer most of you to the paper or to the Q&A section. But the key point, what we try to do in this empirical exercise is to measure the price of idiosyncratic risk. And as I answered earlier, the price of idiosyncratic risk is going to depend on preferences and the degree of under-diversification that are not separately identifiable with the exercise we do. And then it's going to depend on the quantity of idiosyncratic risk, and it's going to depend on the idiosyncratic variance risk premium. And all of these objects can be measured with standard asset pricing exercises. And as somebody had asked, we're going to run an EGARCH model to try to understand what is the behavior over time of the idiosyncratic risk, and also trying to measure what is the premium that is going to be commanded. So let me give you a 2-minute version of what we do. So basically what we try to do is we try to run a specification in which we run the excess return against the expectation of the idiosyncratic volatility going forward. And if there's a positive relationship between the two, and we run this in the cross-section, this coefficient lambda is going to be informative about the idiosyncratic risk premium in this economy. So we run a Fama-Macbeth regression, and we try to assess this coefficient lambda. But to assess that coefficient lambda, we impose a structure on idiosyncratic volatility, which is derived from a joint representation of excess returns that are a function of the usual Fama fringe factors, and a model for the variation, the volatility, which has a mean reversion according to following FOO 2009. And what we show then, and I'm gonna end with this, is that when we run the excess returns against expected conditional volatility of firms, we get a positive coefficient, which is informative about how big the distortions are and the gains from policy interventions. So what I will not have time to go over is, okay, so we also describe how to assess the variance risk premium and how to use those estimates for getting a sense of how big the distortions are. And And what we mean here is that the planner sees incentives for investments that are relatively higher than individual agents would see. So from a corporate finance perspective, the planner would see hurdle rates and decide investments using criteria that are different from the individual agents, and they are different by quite a good margin. So okay, so we discussed in the paper how to use these measures of the externalities that can be disciplined by asset pricing data, and how to implement financial regulation using standard instruments that are a tax shield on debt and risk weights on capital investment. And so given that I ran out of time, let me list the conclusion slide and then go over questions. So basically, just to summarize, so we have derivative theory in which idiosyncratic risk is present, and under-diversification creates an idiosyncratic risk premium and creates, from a social perspective, under-investment and excessive aggregate risk-taking. And we provide sufficient statistics to measure the size and the relative importance of the inefficiencies, and these sufficient statistics can be derived or guided by standard empirical asset pricing exercises. And we also show in the paper today, I didn't have the time to cover, how you can use those measures of inefficiencies to guide policy and guide macro prudential policy through a rationale that was not present in the literature before, which is guided by the presence of non-diversifiable risk and the cyclical properties of idiosyncratic risk. Okay, so thank you once again. Thank you for staying to the end, and then let's open for questions now.
Okay, thank you very much, Felipe, for your presentation. Now we still have time for a couple of questions. In general, I asked to send via chat, and then I can open the mic for you ask yourself the question. So maybe you have briefly touched here, Felipe, regarding the debt. What's the role played by debt when you insert debt for these companies? I am a little curious about that.
Yeah, so the key feature here is to implement anything with risk weights and capital regulation, you need to make equity relatively scarce.
Mm-hmm.
And what the tax shield of that helps do is it makes debt relatively cheap. So the tax shield of debt is going to determine how expensive or the shadow cost of any constraint that interacts with own capital. Okay. So that's kind of the key. So that's the role that that tax shield has, and also if you can do you can use that tax shield or even a subsidy on that to try to control the overall level of investment. So by subsidizing that, you make investment relatively more attractive. So that can help you mitigate the inefficiency that is related to underinvestment.
And the whole idea is to include some constraints to diversification, or the investor could be able to buy any debt from any firms.
For debt here, it's not going to matter because that is not going to carry any risk. So it doesn't really matter if you're buying the debt in this setup that we studied. So that is required to be riskless. And once it's riskless, it doesn't really matter whose debt you're holding.
Okay, understood. Because my question is pretty much, I don't want to be a shareholder, but I might want to be a debt holder because I have different preference regarding risk toward risk. So I could optimally choose not buying the stock, but buying the bonds. But what you're saying is
my impression
risky-free.
is that my impression is that the most of the stories that generate some under diversification and equity holding would also generate through the same mechanisms under diversification and debt holding. So I would expect it. It's kind of an empirical question, but I would expect any debt that is being held by these agents to correlate with the equity they would be holding. In terms of which sector do they hold and which locations, if you take it geographically more seriously.
Okay, understood. Great. Marcelo, you have mics open.
Thanks. I cannot raise my hand given that I'm a co-host. So Felipe, can you come back to the Brownian bridge shock that Rui has asked, and he said that you are now trying to put together a version with a gamma shock. And so what would you gain with the gamma shock? You know, like I could think about so many structures, you know, for this shock that would enrich your model in terms of, you know, the dynamics, but what the gamma would give you, what kind of extra mileage would get out of it?
Yeah, so one issue here is that with the Brownian shock, if you or with many processes, if you're holding a continuum, it would be hard to make you not be perfectly diversified over those shocks. So the way that we create, each agent here is holding a portfolio which is over a range of the circle. And so there are two ways. There are two ways of creating under diversification here, besides the fact that they're holding a continuum of random variables, and we need to be careful about all the like measure theoretic issues that are embedded here. One way is to generate local correlation, which is what the Brownian does. So we construct these shocks using a Brownian bridge, and then we have this correlation structure that decays with distance. And it's such that it integrates away, but only to approximations. So there's no kind of exact law of large numbers in the end, in the setup. So only to the approximation, the variance vanishes. And the gamma is tractable, and it's not so used. So we would get another difficulty in explaining what the structure is. But you can use the property of the gamma that is infinitely divisible, and each guy that is holding a segment of the circle is still going to be holding some idiosyncratic risk because of the fat tails properties of the gamma and the way that this works.
May I add one thing, Felipe?
Yeah, sure.
Just what would you gain with this? Well, the referee asked. So that's basically what would you gain. Like basically just showing that this also works with if we don't have to do any approximations. But at the end, I think the main results will be the same.
Yeah.
That's a good suggestion anyway, right? Given that it's tractable, so it could have been much worse.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
Ask a question, or is there anybody?
Sure.
Yes, Walter.
I didn't understand very well the emphasis of the presentation. If you have the friction that leaves open for idiosyncratic returns to affect prices, I think it's almost immediate that there should be some inefficiency. And the new thing that it seems to me is this restriction for investors of some firms to invest in firms that are nearby in some sense. That I think it's new. So at least I have never thought about it. That's something that might be plausible. And I guess it could give more structure for the inefficiency or for the returns or idiosyncratic returns. And I think it's you try to convey this sense, but you didn't try to motivate more the structure of the correlation that I don't understand. I think it's intriguing, but I don't understand. And that's important for the implications because if, for instance, the source of the idiosyncratic risk being important is stealing, it's because you have firms that the controlling shareholders steal money. And I think the policy implication would be the opposite of what you have. You should take out the tax incentives for that. You want to spur the stock market and prevent the stealing. So I would like to hear something more about.
Okay, so let me. Yeah, so let me. So before getting to the correlation, let me emphasize one thing, which is okay. I wanted to point to something, but let's just leave the slides as they are. And so one thing is that we have an inefficiency for sure because people cannot fully diversify by construction. There's something that prevents them from holding a perfectly well-diversified portfolio. But what we show is that the key thing is that this under-diversification friction doesn't mean that it interacts with returns on investment. Okay, for some reason I cannot write right now. Okay, so it interacts with returns on investment, and these returns are going to be a function of your productivity, and this guy is going to be dispersed. But it also interacts with objects that are endogenous and how competitive input markets are and so on. So the point is that even though policy cannot do anything, or even if policy cannot do anything regarding how well diversified people are, it can do something about the behavior of returns and return dispersion. So return dispersion is endogenous and it is strongly countercyclical. And policy can make it less countercyclical. And policy that dampens aggregate risk taking can help with that, for instance. So that's one of the. So that's one part of them. That's not an answer to all of your question. But that's an answer to the first part, which is, of course, the economy's inefficiency once we introduce some diversification friction. What is less clear is whether there could be something to be done about it, conditional on under-diversification. And what we show is that because return dispersion is endogenous and countercyclical, there is something. This economy has too little investment. This economy has a return dispersion that is too strongly countercyclical, and that makes inefficiencies worse. And okay, so that's an answer to the first part. The second part about stealing and how does a tax shield on that stimulate more stealing, I think it's an interesting avenue to think of, because we don't have any moral hazard frictions or any frictions inside the firms here. And so we don't know much about the interaction. But one thing that I found interesting to think of is that in this environment that we study, external equity holders are under-diversified. So they care about the idiosyncratic risk of the firm. So in most corporate finance models, you have that, okay, the managers care about the return of the firm, how risky it is, because they need to have incentives, they are under-diversified, but the market or whoever finances external equity holders don't care about it. And we have a setup in which external equity holders care about it, and debt holders then depends whether it's riskless debt or risky debt, but could care too. And so I think it opens some questions, but honestly, I don't know. We haven't introduced moral hazard into anything like this.
Okay, I'm mute. So we have time for a final question. Regardless, we are running out of the schedule, but maybe we have, as a complete model. Maybe someone else want to ask something. Okay, so I'd like.
Viriato. Sorry,
okay.
Viriato has raised his hand.
Okay. Where is Viriato here? Okay, I'm not finding.
On the top of the list. The fourth.
Yes, is okay here. Okay. Okay. You're clear to go, Viriato. Ask your question. I don't know what's happening.
I think he's still
Okay.
here.
I think he left. Probably
Maybe
his
he- yeah.
internet broke.
Okay,
Yeah.
so, okay, next time. Felipe and Dejanir, thank you very much, particularly Felipe for this great presentation. Definitely is a dense article paper. I know is under R&R, so I hope you have success on publishing this paper. It's very interesting. And thank you very much for the pleasure of having your presentation here. And I'd like to thank all the audience for being here for our seminar. And in 2 weeks, we're gonna have Marcelo Fernandes presenting betting in alpha, conditionally alpha, right,
On
Marcelo?
conditional offer. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Yeah. So I hope to see everyone here again. Thank you again. Have a nice weekend. Bye.
Okay, thank you.